I've spent 6 years reading other people's money for a living. Title and escrow work doesn't sound like much until you understand what it actually is. I'm the person who goes through every wire transfer, every signature, every notary stamp before a house legally changes hands. I can usually tell inside the first 10 minutes of a loan file whether something doesn't sit right. I just never thought I'd end up using that instinct on my own family. My brother Liam is 3 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, he's been the one people talk about at church, potlucks, and family reunions. Liam got the scholarship. Liam got promoted. Liam's getting married. I got a job. I paid my own rent on time. I kept my Corolla running past 150,000 miles because I didn't see the point in a car payment I didn't need. Nobody ever put that on the family group chat. Our dad, Robert, worked as a machinist out at a plant off I-35 for 31 years, and if he taught us anything, it was that you don't brag about a thing you didn't earn honestly. He died of a heart attack 2 years ago, out in the garage, wrench still in his hand, and it broke something in all of us in different ways. It broke my mother, Iris, into someone who needed Liam more than she'd ever admit out loud. And it broke Liam into someone who needed everyone to think he was doing just fine, even on the days I wasn't sure he was. So when Liam called me in June and said he'd closed on a house out in a new development called Sienna Ridge, past Little Elm, I told him congratulations and meant it. When he texted pictures of the 3-car garage and the stone archway over the front porch, I told him it looked beautiful and I meant that too. I didn't ask how a guy selling insurance policy out of a strip mall off University Drive was affording a $500,000 house with 20% down after only 18 months in that job. That wasn't my business. Or so I told myself, driving home that night with the radio up a little louder than usual. The housewarming was a Saturday night in August. Hot enough that the string lights over the back patio looked like they were sweating right along with everybody else. Liam had a smoker going with brisket he definitely paid somebody else to trim, and a cooler of Miller Lite going warm faster than anyone could drink it. Brittany, his fiancée, was leading people through the walk-in pantry like it was a museum exhibit, and honestly, I got it. It was a nice house, big windows, hardwood floors that still smelled like sawdust. A Texas flag over the mantel that I'm fairly sure came from Hobby Lobby. I brought a bottle of wine and a card with $200 in it, which was more than I had any real business spending that month, hugged my brother at the door, and told him I was proud of him. I meant that one too. About an hour into the party, Liam gathered everybody out on the pool deck to make a toast. He stood up there with a glass of bourbon, my mother right beside him, beaming like he'd just been sworn into office, and he talked for a minute about hard work and dreaming big and never settling for less than you deserve. Normal party stuff, up until he looked over the crowd, found me, and said, "Some of us actually worked for what we have." Nobody had to ask who some of us wasn't talking about. The backyard laughed. Not everybody, but enough people that it landed exactly how he wanted it to. My Aunt Denise snorted into her wine glass. Brittany's brother chuckled and studied his shoes real hard all of a sudden. And my mother, who I had driven 40 minutes to see, who I had helped move a couch for 3 weekends earlier without being asked twice, turned to me with this soft, syrupy little smile and said, "Maybe one day you'll catch up, honey." I didn't say anything back. I want to be honest about that part, because there's a version of this where I throw my wine or say something sharp enough to make people gasp, and that would probably make for a better scene. That's not what happened. I smiled, because that's what you do, and I said, "This really is a beautiful house, Liam." I meant that too, because it was. Then I found Brittany, told her the pantry really was impressive, hugged my mother goodbye, and drove back to Denton with the radio off the whole way home. Here's the thing nobody standing in that backyard knew. 3 weeks before that housewarming, a file had landed on my desk at work that I hadn't been able to stop turning over in my head. Every so often at the title company, we get pulled onto what's called a post-closing review. A lender or underwriter flags something about an already closed loan and wants a second set of eyes before it turns into a real problem. My manager, Mr. Foster, dropped one on my desk on a Tuesday with a sticky note that just said, "When you get a sec." It was a home equity line of credit, $85,000, taken out against a paid-off house in Denton. The borrower's name on the power of attorney was written as I. Coleman, acting on behalf of I.R. Coleman, the same person, technically just written 2 slightly different ways on 2 different pages. That's exactly the kind of small, dumb inconsistency that either means absolutely nothing or means everything. I didn't connect it to my own mother right away, Not at first, because I see a lot of Colemans in a year doing this job. It's not exactly a rare name in North Texas. What I did flag was the notary seal, which looked just slightly off compared to that notary's registered stamp on file with the county. I sent it up to our fraud desk with a note and went back to my regular files because that's the job. You flag it, and you move on. You're not a detective. You're just somebody with a decent eye. A woman named Grace Whitfield called me 2 days after that. She introduced herself as a fraud investigator working with the title insurance underwriter, and she asked me a few routine questions about the file, about how a signature discrepancy like that usually gets caught, whether it was common. I answered what I could and figured that was the last I'd hear of it. I didn't put together whose file it actually was until I was standing in my brother's backyard 3 weeks later, looking at a $500,000 house with a pool and a 3-car garage that a guy in his position had no real business affording through normal financing. Something about that exact number kept nagging at me on the drive home. $85,000. That's almost precisely what a 20% down payment comes out to on a house in that price range, once you tack on closing costs. I sat in my car outside my apartment for a long time before I made myself go inside. I called Delilah first, because that's what you do before you go and do something you can't take back. Delilah's worked the desk next to mine for 4 years, and she's about the only person at that company who can talk me out of a bad decision without ever once making me feel small for almost having one. "You think your brother forged your mama's signature," she said. It wasn't really a question. I think I need to look at an address before I say anything else out loud. I couldn't pull the file myself. That's not how any of this works. There are rules for a reason, and I've spent 6 years building a career on following them even when it's inconvenient. So I called Grace Whitfield back instead, told her I had reason to believe I might have a personal connection to the file she was investigating, and let her do her job from there. I made that call on a Saturday night, close to 11 o'clock, and I gave her my mother's name, my mother's address, and my brother's name, and asked as calm as I could manage whether any of it matched what she already had in front of her. She couldn't confirm details to me directly, she said so plainly, and I respected her more for saying it, but she also didn't tell me I was wrong. She thanked me and said she'd be in touch and that if what I was describing checked out, things would likely move fast because a fraudulent power of attorney used to put a lien on an elderly homeowner's property is the kind of thing that gets escalated, not filed away in a drawer. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I wanted anything bad to happen to my brother, because I kept thinking about my mother, 71 years old, sleeping in that house on Sherwood Lane my father spent 31 years paying off, with no idea there might now be a debt against it she'd never agreed to. She called me at 8:40 the next morning, and her voice didn't sound anything like the woman who'd told me to catch up 12 hours earlier. It sounded like somebody standing in water that had just turned a lot colder than she expected. "There are people here," she said. "At Liam's house. They're asking questions about the house in Denton." I got dressed and drove out to Sienna Ridge faster than I probably should have. By the time I pulled up, the driveway that had been packed with guests' cars the night before had 2 unmarked sedans in it instead, along with a Denton County vehicle parked half up on the curb. Liam was standing on his own front porch in gym shorts, hair still doing whatever hair does after a night of bourbon and taking credit for a life he hadn't fully paid for. And Grace Whitfield stood across from him with a folder in her hand, and the kind of patience in her voice that told me this wasn't her first time doing exactly this. I got most of what happened next from my mother, because I stayed back near the mailbox and didn't get close enough to make any of it about me. Grace explained that a home equity line of credit had been opened against the Sherwood Lane property using a power of attorney my mother had never signed, notarized with a stamp that had been reported missing out of an office in Louisville 8 months earlier. The $85,000 from that line of credit had gone out in 2 wire transfers, straight into the account that later funded the earnest money and down payment on the house we were all standing in front of. Brittany came out onto the porch in a robe, asking what was going on, and nobody answered her right away because nobody quite knew how to. My mother didn't yell. That's the part I wasn't ready for. She just stood there in yesterday's church clothes since she'd apparently stayed over Saturday night, and she looked at that house, really looked at it. The stone archway, the big windows, the flag from Hobby Lobby like she was seeing it clearly for the first time. Then she looked at my brother and said, quiet enough that I almost missed it, "This was my house, your father's house." Liam didn't have much that made any sense. He said something about meaning to pay it back. He said something about telling her eventually, once things settled. Grace Whitfield wasn't there to listen to any of that. She was there to serve paperwork and walk through next steps. And from what I understand, those next steps were already well past the point where an apology could fix them. I didn't say some of us worked for what we have back to him, even though I turned that phrase over like a rock in my pocket the whole drive home. It wouldn't have felt like winning. It would have felt like becoming exactly the kind of person who needs to say things like that. What I did instead, over the weeks that followed, was help my mother. I sat with her at a different branch of the title company, not my desk, a different office entirely, because that's how conflict of interest works, and I wasn't going to cut a single corner on something this personal, while she filed to dispute the lien and get that forged power of attorney thrown out. I drove her to 2 appointments with an attorney who handles elder financial fraud. I didn't do any of it because I needed her to notice. I did it because it was my mother's house, and my father built a life around paying it off clean, and that meant something to me whether or not anybody ever raised a glass to it. Liam's house is still sitting out there in Sienna Ridge, last I heard, tangled up in civil and criminal proceedings that'll probably take a year or better to sort out. Brittany moved back in with her sister. My mother hasn't brought up catching up since. Some things you stop saying once you've watched them cost something real. A few weeks after it all came apart, Delilah and I sat in a booth at Rosie's off Main Street in Denton, the kind of diner with laminated menus and a waitress who's called every single customer Han since about 1994. I told her I kept waiting to feel something bigger than what I actually felt. "What do you feel?" she asked. "Tired," I said. "A little sad, not proud." I figured I'd feel proud. She reached over and stole a fry off my plate, which she does every time without asking, and said, "You don't throw a party when the truth finally comes out. You just go back to doing your job right." She was right, the way she usually is. I went back to doing my job right. I still read other people's money for a living, and I still catch the small dumb inconsistencies that either mean nothing or mean absolutely everything, and I still don't say much when somebody tries to make me feel small at a party. I've just got a clearer idea now of why that matters. You don't have to defend your worth out loud the second somebody tries to shrink it. Quiet, unglamorous integrity. The kind that shows up in boring places like paperwork, follow-through, and doing your job carefully, even when nobody's watching, tends to outlast the kind of success that needs an audience to feel real. And there's a practical piece worth carrying too. If you've got aging parents, check in on their finances and any documents tied to their home every so often, even if nothing seems wrong. Financial fraud against elderly homeowners, especially through forged powers of attorney, happens more than most people realize, and it's rarely a stranger who does it.